Hey, welcome. Today, we're going to dig into the intellectual architecture of one of the most influential documents in the world, the U.S. Constitution. We're going to explore a really specific perspective on its philosophical and, well, its moral underpinnings. Okay, let's just dive right in.
So you gotta ask, right? Where did the framers even get their ideas? I mean, every great structure needs a blueprint, a set of foundational principles that guide the whole design. The source material we're looking at today has a pretty interesting answer. It suggests that a huge part of that blueprint can be traced back to a very old source, the Bible.
All right, so let's get right to the heart of it. We're going to unpack the central claim made in our source text, which frames the Constitution's design in a very specific way.
So here it is, the core argument we're exploring, that the Constitution's framework, its actual structure and logic, was deeply influenced by a biblical worldview. We're talking about ideas of human nature, justice, and authority. It's a pretty bold claim for sure, so let's break it down piece by piece.
The first pillar of this argument really gets at the most fundamental question of all. Where do our rights come from? And according to this perspective, the answer to that question is the absolute cornerstone of the entire American political experiment. So, this is the crucial point. Think about it. If a government gives you rights, that same government can also take them away. But the argument here is that certain rights are inalienable, which means they can't be touched precisely because they don't come from any king or parliament or president. They exist before government is even a thing.
And here we see the theological root of that very idea. The source points straight to this verse from Genesis to argue that human value and dignity, well, they aren't just a social construct, they're inherent, they're built in, because people are made in the image of a creator. And that idea, right there, forms the whole basis for equality and rights. And this is where the source connects the dots, directly from theology to politics. It highlights this famous line from the Declaration of Independence as the translation of that biblical concept into America's founding creed. The language isn't an accident, it's a direct echo.
So, this brings us to our second pillar. If the first one is all about where rights come from, this one is about who's supposed to protect them. And from this viewpoint, the answer is, well, imperfect people. And that right there creates a big problem that needs a very specific design solution.
This slide just lays out the argument in a perfect parallel. On the left, you've got the biblical premise of human fallibility, that people are inherently flawed. And on the right, you have James Madison's famous rationale for limited government. The claim is that Madison's political science is basically a direct application of this theological realism. You just don't give absolute power to flawed beings.
So what do you do about it? You build a system with safeguards. This perspective presents these core features of the Constitution. Separating power between the branches, giving each branch a check on the others, and splitting power between the federal and state governments as the practical, almost mechanical solutions to the problem of human nature. Okay, on to our third pillar. So we've got God-given rights and a government that's designed for flawed people, but according to the source, there's a third essential element, the moral character of the people themselves. The idea here is that a system of laws only really works if the citizens believe in some kind of objective standard of right and wrong that exists above the laws themselves. In other words, the rule of law needs a foundation of moral law. You need a shared understanding that some things are just right and some things are just wrong, no matter what's technically legal. And wow, you really can't get a more direct statement of this argument than this quote from John Adams. The source uses this to powerfully illustrate the belief that the machine of government, no matter how perfectly designed it is, just can't function without the fuel of public virtue. This leads us right into our fourth pillar, which deals with the very form of the government. The source we're looking at suggests that even the idea of a government formed by the people has these deep theological roots in the concept of a covenant. This verse from Exodus, it lays out the model of a covenant. It's a conditional, mutual agreement between God and the people of Israel. See, it's not a top-down decree. It's a two-way promise. And this model, the source claims, profoundly shaped early American political thinking.
So let's just define that really clearly. When you adapt this idea for politics, a covenant is a voluntary compact. It's the people themselves agreeing to come together to create a government and to live by its rules, all with an understanding that this agreement is made before a higher authority.
And there it is. That's the final connection.
This model of a people voluntarily binding themselves together under God is, according to this perspective, the direct ancestor of one of democracy's most cherished principles, that a just government has to get its power from the consent of the governed.
Now, before we conclude, the material makes a really critical distinction about what liberty is. In this view, true freedom isn't anarchy. It's not just the ability to do whatever you feel like. It's a structured liberty, the freedom to do what is right within a framework of moral law.
So to bring it all together, the final takeaway from the source is that all these pillars are totally interconnected. The entire system, rights, checks on power, consent of the governed, it all depends on a virtuous citizenry that acknowledges a moral authority beyond the state itself.
And this leads to a pretty stark warning. The argument concludes that if those shared moral beliefs that inspired the Constitution begin to fade away, the whole structure becomes unstable. The capacity for people to actually govern themselves effectively starts to crumble.
And that brings us to our final and pretty provocative question. It's the central challenge posed by the material we've explored today. Can a system designed with one set of beliefs continue to function if those beliefs are no longer widely held? It's a huge question and definitely one worth thinking about. Thanks for joining me.